They said the well was empty, said old Thomas Whitmore had lost his mind before he died, digging 30 feet into dry earth for nothing but ghosts. But on the morning they lowered his daughter down on a frayed rope, the wind over that forgotten ranch went quiet in a way that made even the horses turn their heads and listen. Before we go any further, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And if you believe some truths are buried for a reason, stay with this story, because what Eliza Whitmore found beneath that dry well didn't just change her life. It changed the way an entire valley would remember her name. The sun sat low over the Nevada dust, throwing long shadows across a ranch that hadn't seen good water in 10 years, fences leaning like tired men, wood bleached gray by seasons that didn't care who owned the land. And Eliza stood alone beside that well, her boots half buried in powdery dirt, fingers wrapped around a rope her father had tied himself long before anyone thought he'd gone strange. People in town, said Thomas Whitmore talked to himself toward the end, said he spent nights staring into that hole like it was speaking back, said no decent man wastes time on dry ground unless he's hiding something or losing something. And most folks had already decided which one it was. Eliza didn't answer them. Never did. She kept her head down, worked what little cattle she had left, and listened to the silence her father left behind, the kind that settles in your chest and stays there. What bothered her wasn't the gossip. It was the map she found folded inside his coat the day they buried him, a rough sketch drawn in steady hands, leading nowhere but back to this well, marked with a single word he'd underlined twice. Truth. She had turned that paper over a dozen times, searching for a mistake, for a second path, for anything that would make more sense than digging deeper into a place everyone knew was empty. But every line brought her back here, to the circle of cracked stone and shadow. A hawk cried somewhere overhead, the sound sharp and lonely, and Eliza glanced once toward the horizon where the town sat miles away, small and distant, like it had already forgotten her. Then she looked down into the well, into that dark that swallowed sunlight after the first few feet, and she made her choice. The rope creaked as she tested it, rough fibers biting into her palms, the knot still strong despite years of dust and weather. Her father had tied it well, better than most men in the county, and that thought settled something in her chest. Not comfort exactly, but a kind of stubborn trust. She wrapped the rope around her forearm, swung one leg over the edge, and began to descend. The first 10 feet were nothing, just heat and the smell of dry stone, her boots finding the worn indentations her father had carved into the wall. But then the air changed, cooler, carrying a faint scent she couldn't place. Something like old earth after rain, something that didn't belong in a place that hadn't seen water in years. She paused, breath slow, listening, and for a moment there was only the soft scrape of rope against rock and the distant whisper of wind. Above, but beneath that, just beneath, there was something else, a stillness that felt watched. Eliza tightened her grip and kept going. At 15 feet the light thinned, turning the world into shades of gray, her fingers brushing along the wall for balance, feeling grooves that weren't natural, lines too deliberate, too careful, as if someone had shaped this space with purpose. Her father's map flickered in her mind, that single word, truth, and she felt it then, not fear, not yet, but the sense that she was stepping into something that had been waiting a long time for her to arrive. 20 feet down, her boot struck something that wasn't stone, a flat surface where there should have been none, and she froze, heart steady but heavy, lowering herself another inch until her weight settled onto it. A narrow ledge carved into the wall. She leaned closer, squinting through the dim light, and saw it. A seam in the rock, a line running vertical like a door that had never been meant to be. Found, her breath caught, just for a second, and in that second the world above felt impossibly far away, like the life she had known had already slipped out of reach. She reached out, fingertips brushing that seam, and the stone felt different, smoother, warmer somehow, as if it held a memory of every hand that had touched it before. "What did you leave me, Pa?" she whispered. The words barely sound at all, and for the first time since she'd started down, the rope above her swayed, just slightly, though no wind could reach this deep. Eliza didn't look up. She didn't climb back. She pressed her palm against that hidden line and felt the ground of her world begin, quietly, to shift. The stone did not move at first. and for a long second Eliza Whitmore thought she had imagined it, that the seam beneath her hand was nothing more than a trick of shadow and hope. But then she pressed harder, fingers spreading, palm flat against the cool surface, and something deep within the wall answered with a low, quiet shift that traveled through the rock and into her bones. She held her breath, listening, because down here every sound mattered. Every small movement echoed like a secret, being told too loudly. And when the seam widened just enough to let a thin line of darkness breathe back at her, she felt it, that same strange certainty she had carried since the moment she stepped off the edge above, that she was no longer just searching, she was being led. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for her shoulders, and she hesitated only once, glancing up toward the faint circle of light 30 feet above. The world she knew reduced to a pale coin hanging in the distance. And it struck her then how small it looked, how easy it would be to let it go. She turned back without calling out, without leaving a mark, and slipped sideways into the hidden space. The air changed immediately, thicker, carrying the scent of leather and something faintly sweet, like dried sage long forgotten, and the ground beneath her boots leveled out. No longer the curved wall of a well, but a flat surface carefully shaped by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. Eliza reached behind her, gripping the rope one last time before letting it rest against the stone, not tying it, not securing it, just leaving it there as if some part of her already knew she would not need it the same way again. She took a step forward, then another, her hand brushing along the wall for balance, and the darkness began to settle around her eyes, revealing shapes where there had been none, edges, corners, a space larger than it should have been beneath a simple ranch well. There was no wind down here, no sound from above, only the steady rhythm of her breathing and the soft crunch of dust under her boots. And each step felt heavier, not with fear, but with meaning, as if the ground itself remembered every foot that had crossed it before. A faint glimmer caught her eye to the left, not light exactly, but a reflection, and she turned slowly, lowering herself to one knee, fingers brushing against something smooth and curved, a piece of metal worked by hand, worn but intact. And when she lifted it into what little light filtered through the narrow opening behind her, she saw the pattern etched along its surface, unfamiliar yet deliberate, lines that curved and met in ways that spoke of a language she did not know but somehow recognized. She swallowed, heart steady but deeper now, and set the object back exactly where she found it, as if disturbing it too much might break whatever fragile truth was holding this place together. Further in, the space opened wider, the ceiling rising just enough for her to stand fully, and there, against the far wall, she saw it, a shape that did not belong to stone or shadow, something that had once been part of a living world. Eliza approached slowly, each step measured, until the outline became clear. The remains of a person laid carefully on a raised platform of wood and earth, not abandoned, not forgotten, but placed with intention, as if this hidden room was not a secret to be buried but a memory to be protected. She stopped a few feet away, not reaching out, not yet, because even without touching, she could see what rested against the still form, a necklace of small stones and silver, the same pattern she had just seen in her hand, the same quiet language woven into every piece. Her father had never worn anything like that, never spoken of it, never even hinted that such things had a place in their lives. And yet here it was, beneath his land, beneath his well, beneath everything he had shown the world. Eliza's chest tightened, not with panic, but with a slow, unfolding understanding that did not yet have words, and she crouched lower, eyes tracing the details, the careful way the figure had been arranged, the respect in the placement, the absence of neglect. This was not a hiding place, it was a promise kept. Her gaze shifted, drawn to something resting beside the figure, a folded piece of paper, edges worn but intact, sealed once and opened again, and her name written across it in a hand she knew better than her own reflection. Eliza did not move right away, did not reach for it, because in that moment she understood that whatever was written there would not simply answer her questions, it would replace them with something larger, something that would not let her return to the person she had been standing beside that well only minutes ago. The silence pressed in around her, thick and patient, as if the earth itself was waiting to see what she would do. And above, far beyond the layers of stone and dust, the rope swayed once more, unseen, unnoticed, marking the last fragile connection to a life that was already beginning to feel like it belonged to someone else. Eliza Whitmore reached for the letter the way a person reaches for something that might disappear if they hesitate too long, her fingers steady but slow, as if the paper itself could feel the weight of the moment and pull away if she moved too quickly. And when she finally touched it, the surface was dry and warm, not brittle like something forgotten, but preserved, as if it had been waiting, not for anyone, but for her. She turned it once in her hands, tracing the edges, the familiar curve of her father's handwriting, spelling out her name with a care he had never shown in anything else. And for a brief second she closed her eyes, remembering the way he used to write at the kitchen table, quiet, deliberate, as though every word mattered more than the land he worked. When she opened them again, the room felt smaller, closer, the silence thicker, and she broke the seal with a careful motion that sounded louder than it should have in that underground stillness. The paper unfolded in her hands, and the first line stopped her breath before she could read the rest. If you are holding this, then you chose truth over comfort. The words ran steady across the page. No hesitation, no apology, and Eliza felt something shift inside her chest. Not pain, not fear, but recognition, as if the man who wrote those words had known exactly who she would become long before she did. She lowered herself onto the edge of the platform, the letter, trembling just slightly now as her eyes moved across the lines. And with each sentence the world she had built around herself began to loosen, threads pulling free one by one. He wrote about the land, about the well, about the day he found it was never dry at all, just sealed, hidden, protected by those who understood that some places were not meant to be seen by everyone. And then he wrote about a storm, years ago, one that had driven him far beyond the edges of his own property, into territory he had been warned to avoid, where he found someone who should not have been alone. Eliza's fingers tightened on the page as she read, the words painting a memory she had never lived but somehow felt, a young woman with dark hair and steady eyes, injured but unafraid, who spoke a language he did not understand, but whose meaning he felt all the same. And he wrote that he did not save her because it was right. He saved her because leaving her would have been something he could not carry for the rest of his life. The letter paused there, as if even the memory had weight, and Eliza swallowed, her gaze drifting for a moment to the still form beside her, the necklace resting against silent bones. And she understood, not fully, but enough to feel the direction of the truth pulling her forward. The next lines came slower, heavier, each word placed with intention, and he told her that the woman had not been alone, that she belonged to a people who did not measure worth the way the town did, who saw beyond names and fences and ownership, and that in their eyes, a debt was not something forgotten or repaid lightly. Eliza's breath steadied as she continued, her father's voice no longer just memory but something present, guiding, explaining in the only way he knew how. He wrote that the land he owned was not truly his, that the well marked something older than any claim or deed, and that he had been entrusted with it, not by law, but by promise. Her heart beat slower now, deeper, as if it had found a rhythm that matched the quiet of the room, and she read the line that changed everything. You are not who they think you are. The ink pressed harder there, the letters darker, as if he had known this would be the moment she would either turn away or step fully into what he had left behind. Eliza did not stop, did not look up. She read on, and the truth unfolded in a way that felt both impossible and inevitable, that the woman he had helped had given him something in return, not out of obligation, but out of trust, a life placed into his hands with the understanding that it would be protected, raised in a world that might never accept it, but would at least allow it to grow. Her vision blurred for a second, not from tears, but from the sheer weight of the realization pressing in from every side, and she lowered the letter just enough to breathe, her eyes shifting once more to the necklace, to the patterns she had seen, to the room that had been hidden beneath everything she thought she knew. When she lifted the page again, the final lines waited, quiet but unyielding. He wrote that he had never told her because the world above would not understand, that it would try to take what it did not recognize and turn it into something smaller, something easier to control, and that he had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that she would never need to know, that she could live her life without carrying the weight of two worlds. Eliza's fingers curled slightly around the paper as she read the last sentence, the one that felt less like a statement and more like a hand reaching across time. If you found this, then they have already begun to look for you. And the room seemed to hold its breath with her, the silence stretching just enough for the meaning to settle, not as fear, but as certainty. She folded the letter slowly, carefully, placing it back where she had found it, her movements precise, deliberate, and when she finally rose to her feet, something in the way she stood had changed, not outwardly, not in a way anyone above could see yet, but in the quiet alignment of who she was and who she had just learned to be. Eliza Whitmore turned toward the narrow opening behind her, the rope still hanging where she left it, a thin line back to the surface. And for a moment she did not move, because she understood now that climbing back up would not return her to anything she had known. It would only reveal what had been waiting for her all along. Eliza Whitmore did not rush for the rope, not the way she would have an hour ago when the world still made sense in straight lines and simple truths. Instead, she stood in that quiet chamber beneath the earth and let the weight of what she had read settle into her bones, her breathing slow and even, her gaze drifting once more across the room as if seeing it for the first time, not as a hidden place, but as something sacred, something preserved with intention and patience far beyond her own. Years. The figure on the platform no longer felt like a mystery to solve, but a presence to acknowledge, and she stepped closer, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with a kind of respect that came from understanding that she had crossed a line few ever did, a line her father had guarded in silence. She lowered herself again, her hand hovering just above the necklace before finally brushing it, light as a breath, the metal cool against her fingertips, and in that brief contact something shifted, not in the room, but in her, like a memory that did not belong to her rising just enough to be felt without being fully seen. She pulled her hand back slowly, her eyes narrowing just slightly, as if focusing on something far beyond the walls of stone, and for a moment the silence was not empty. It was full, layered with something older than the ranch above, older than the town that whispered about her father, something that had been here long before any of them arrived. Eliza stood. Again, her shoulders settling into a posture that felt unfamiliar and yet entirely natural, as if her body had been waiting for this alignment all along. And she turned toward the opening without looking back, not out of disregard, but because she understood now that nothing behind her needed to be carried in her hands. It was already part of her. The rope hung where she had left it, a thin line of coarse fibers leading upward into a circle of pale light. And for the first time since she began her descent, she did not see it as a lifeline, but as a boundary, a final thread, connecting two versions of herself. She reached for it anyway, fingers wrapping around the rough surface, testing its strength out of habit rather than necessity, and began to climb. The movement was steady, controlled, her boots finding each carved step without searching, her arms pulling her upward with a strength that felt deeper than muscle, driven by something quieter, more certain. 10 feet. Then 15, the light growing stronger, washing the shadows from her vision, and with it came the distant sounds of the world above, the faint rustle of wind across dry grass, the creak of wood, the low, familiar rhythm of a place that had not changed even as she had. But something else rode that silence now, something she did not remember hearing when she stood beside the well before, a presence that was not loud, not obvious, but there all the same, like a held breath waiting to be released. She slowed as she neared the top, her hand pausing just below the rim, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because she understood now what her father had meant in that final line, that if she found the truth, then something had already begun to move toward her. Eliza lifted herself the last few inches and stepped onto the dry earth, the sun hitting her face with a brightness that felt sharper than before, the sky wide and indifferent above her. And for a second, everything looked exactly as it had. The same cracked ground, the same leaning fence, the same quiet stretch of land that had been hers for years. But then she noticed it, not with her eyes at first, but with that same sense that had guided her below, the awareness of something present, something waiting. She turned slowly, not searching, not scanning, just allowing her gaze to settle where it needed to. And there they were, at the far edge of the property, just beyond the line where her land blurred into open country. A group of figures stood in stillness, their silhouettes clear against the pale horizon, unmoving, silent, watching. They were not close enough to threaten, not positioned in a way that suggested urgency or force. They simply stood, as if they had always been there and had only now become visible to her. Eliza did not reach for anything, did not call out. She simply stood beside the well, the rope at her side, the sun at her back, and met their presence with a calm that would have surprised the girl she had been that morning. The wind moved gently across the land, carrying the faint scent of dust and something else she could not name, and in that quiet exchange, distance holding them apart, yet connecting them in a way words never could. One of the figures shifted. It was subtle, a single step forward, then stillness again. And though she could not see the details of their faces from where she stood, she felt it clearly, the absence of hostility, the presence of recognition. Eliza Whitmore did not step back, did not retreat into the safety of the ranch behind her. Instead, she took one slow step forward, then another, not closing the distance entirely, but enough to show that she understood something had changed between them. The land stretched wide and silent, the well behind her now, just a circle of stone like any other to anyone who did not know what lay beneath. And as the sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the ground, the figures remained, patient, unmoving, as if waiting not for her to speak, but for her to decide who she would be now that the truth had found her. Eliza Whitmore did not speak when the distance between her and the waiting figures settled into something real, something that could no longer be mistaken for imagination or trick of light. She simply stood with the wind moving softly across her shoulders, her hands resting at her sides, and let the silence do what words never could, because in that moment she understood something her father had never said out loud, that the truth beneath the surface did not demand explanation. It revealed itself through presence. The figures did not rush forward, did not call out. They held their ground with a stillness that felt intentional, measured, as if every movement had meaning and every second carried weight. And after a long breath that seemed to stretch beyond time, the one who had stepped forward earlier took another step, then another, closing the distance slowly, not as an approach, but as an acknowledgement. Eliza felt no fear rise in her chest, no instinct to retreat or defend, only that same quiet certainty that had guided her down into the earth and back again. And she matched the movement with one step of her own, then another, until the space between them became something shared rather than dividing. The details came into view gradually, not all at once. The lines of a face shaped by sun and time, eyes that held both strength and calm, clothing marked with patterns she had seen below, not identical, but carrying the same language, the same quiet story woven into fabric and form. Neither of them spoke, not yet, because there was no need. The understanding passed between them in the way they stood, in the absence of tension, in the simple fact that neither turned away. The others remained where they were, forming a loose line along the edge of her land, their presence steady and watchful but not imposing, as if they were there not to take, not to claim, but to witness. Eliza's gaze did not waver as the one before her stopped a few feet away, close enough now that the silence between them felt full rather than empty. And in that quiet space, she noticed something she would have missed before, a faint mark at the edge of the person's wrist, a pattern that mirrored the etching on the metal she had held below, subtle but unmistakable, a connection drawn not by words but by repetition across time. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the scent of dry earth and something softer beneath it. And for a brief moment, Eliza felt the echo of that underground stillness return, grounding her, reminding her that what stood before her was not separate from what she had just left behind. It was part of the same truth unfolding in a different form. The figure inclined their head just slightly, not a bow, not submission, but a gesture of recognition, and Eliza felt something inside her settle into place, a question she had carried for years dissolving without needing an answer. She did not mirror the gesture immediately. Instead, she allowed a breath to pass, steady and measured, before giving the smallest nod in return, not out of politeness, but because it felt right, because it felt earned. Time moved differently in that moment, stretching and folding in ways that made the past and present feel less like separate things and more like pieces of the same story finally aligning. And though no words had been spoken, something had already been agreed upon. Eliza became aware of the well behind her, not by sight, but by memory, by the knowledge of what rested beneath it. And she understood then that it had never been a secret meant to be hidden forever. It had been a threshold, one her father had guarded until she was ready to cross it. The figure before her shifted their weight slightly, not a step forward, not a retreat, just enough to break the stillness in a way that invited rather than demanded. And Eliza felt the meaning in it, not as a command, but as a possibility. She glanced once, briefly, toward the horizon beyond them, toward the direction of the town that had shaped her life in ways she could no longer fully belong to, then back to the person standing in front of her, whose presence felt both unfamiliar and deeply known at the same time. The choice before her was not spoken, not defined, but it was clear as the line between shadow and sunlight, between what she had been told and what she had now seen for herself. Eliza Whitmore did not rush to decide, did not step fully forward or turn away. Instead, she allowed the moment to exist as it was, suspended between two worlds, and in that stillness, she realized something simple and unshakable, that the answer was not something she needed to find. It was something she would become. The wind moved again, soft and steady, carrying the quiet across the land, and the figures at the edge of her property remained as they were, patient, grounded, as if they understood that some decisions could not be forced, only lived into. Eliza's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her shoulders settling, her gaze deepening, and though from a distance nothing about her would seem different, up close, in the space between heartbeats and breath, it was clear that the girl who had stood beside that well at dawn was no longer the same person standing here now, and neither side of her world would ever see her the same way again. Eliza Whitmore did not notice when the sun climbed higher, only that the light shifted across the land in a way that made everything sharper, clearer, as if the world itself had decided to stop hiding behind dust and distance. And still she stood facing the one who had stepped forward, neither of them speaking, neither of them needing to fill the silence with anything unnecessary. It was the figure who moved first, not closer, but to the side, a small shift that opened space rather than closed it. And in that simple motion, there was an invitation that did not demand acceptance, only awareness. Eliza followed the gesture with her eyes before her body responded, turning slightly, her boots pressing into the dry ground with a steadiness that felt different from the way she had walked this land all her life, as if each step now carried intention instead of habit. The others in the distance did not break their formation, but something in their stillness softened, the tension of waiting, easing into something more patient, more certain, and Eliza realized they had not come here to test her or to take anything from her. They had come because something had already been decided long before she climbed down into that well. She moved another step forward, then another, until she stood not quite among them, but no longer apart. The line between her world and theirs no longer marked by distance alone. The person closest to her extended a hand slowly, not reaching toward her, but lowering it toward the ground between them, palm open, and for a moment Eliza did not understand, her gaze following the motion until she saw it, a small object resting in the dust, something she had not noticed before, something placed there with care. She crouched down without hesitation, her movements smooth and deliberate, and picked it up, the weight light but undeniable, the surface cool against her skin. It was a pendant, shaped differently from the one below, but bearing the same patterns, the same quiet language etched into its surface. And when she turned it slightly in the sunlight, the lines seemed to shift, not physically, but in the way they were understood, as if they revealed more the longer she looked. Eliza closed her fingers around it gently, not claiming it, not rejecting it, simply holding it as it was offered. And when she rose again, her gaze met the one in front of her with a clarity that had not been there before, a recognition that did not need explanation. The figure inclined their head once more, a fraction deeper this time, and behind them, one by one, the others followed, not in perfect unison, but in a rhythm that felt natural, organic. each movement a reflection of something shared rather than commanded. Eliza felt the air shift again, not in temperature, not in sound, but in meaning, as if the space around her had been quietly rearranged to include her in a way it never had before. She did not bow, did not mirror them exactly. Instead, she stood as she was, shoulders steady, chin level, and allowed the moment to pass through her, without forcing it into something it was not. The wind picked up slightly, brushing past her hair, carrying with it the scent of the land. And for the first time, she noticed how familiar it felt, not just the dryness of the ranch, but something deeper beneath it, something that had always been there, but had never been named. Her grip on the pendant loosened just enough for her to feel its edges more clearly. The grooves pressed into the metal fitting against her skin as if shaped for her hand. And she understood then that this was not a gift in the way. She had once understood the word. It was a recognition, a confirmation of something that had already been set in motion long before she knew to look for it. Eliza glanced back once, over her shoulder, toward the well, the rope still hanging, the circle of stone unchanged, and she realized that from where she stood now, it looked smaller, not in size, but in significance, no longer the center of her world, but a doorway she had already walked through. When she turned forward again, the figure who had stepped out first had moved slightly, creating a path that led away from the ranch, not sharply, not abruptly, but gently, as if inviting her to follow without ever asking her to leave. Eliza did not step immediately. She let the silence stretch one more time, grounding herself in the place she had always known, acknowledging it without clinging to it. And then she took a single step in the direction that had opened before her. It was not a departure, not yet, but it was not hesitation either. It was movement, quiet and certain, the kind that did not need to be explained to anyone watching from a distance. The figures did not surround her, did not close in. They simply adjusted, making space for her presence among them without breaking their own. And together they stood there for a moment longer, the land stretching wide beneath the midday sun, the past and present resting side by side without conflict. Eliza Whitmore did not look back again, not because she had forgotten what lay behind her, but because she carried it differently now, not as something that defined her, but as something that had led her exactly where she needed to stand. And as the wind moved once more across the open ground, the quiet held, deep and unbroken, as if the world itself understood that some changes did not need to be announced, only lived. Eliza Whitmore did not realize how far she had walked until the shape of her ranch faded behind her into something smaller than memory, the well no longer visible, the fence lines dissolving into the open stretch of land that had once felt like the edge of her world. And still she moved forward, not led, not guided by words, but carried by that same quiet certainty that had begun beneath the earth and now followed her above it. The group did not travel like people in a hurry. There was no urgency in their steps, no sense of destination pressing them. Onward, they moved with a rhythm that matched the land itself, steady, unforced, as if each mile belonged as much to them as it did to the wind that crossed it. Eliza found herself adjusting without thinking, her pace aligning, her breathing settling into something deeper, more grounded, and though no one spoke, she did not feel alone in the silence. It was shared, understood, filled with meaning that did not need to be explained. The pendant rested in her hand at first, her fingers tracing its edges, the patterns catching the light in small flashes that seemed to shift depending on how she held it. And after a while she slipped it into her pocket, not to hide it, but because she no longer needed to look at it to know what it meant. The land changed slowly as they moved, the dry, brittle grass giving way to patches of softer earth, the air carrying a faint trace of something green beneath the dust, and Eliza noticed it without searching. The way a person notices the difference between holding their breath and finally letting it go. One of the figures moved closer at some point, not stepping directly beside her, but within the space where presence could be felt without intrusion, and for a while they walked like that, side by side without touching, without speaking, sharing a path that did not need to be defined. Eliza's thoughts did not race the way they might have before, did not demand answers or explanations. They moved slower now, deeper, turning over what she had read, what she had seen, what she had begun to understand about the life her father had built around her without ever telling her why. She thought of the letter, of the way his words had carried both truth and restraint, of the way he had chosen silence not out of fear, but out of protection, and she felt something soften inside her, not forgiveness, because there had been no anger, but a kind of quiet acceptance that what he had done had not been about hiding her from the world, but about giving her the chance to choose it for herself. The sun moved across the sky, climbing higher, then beginning its slow descent, and the shadows lengthened in a way that marked time without needing to measure it. And still the group moved, never breaking, never rushing, as if the path itself mattered more than where it led. Eliza noticed small things as they traveled, the way the ground shifted underfoot, the way certain stones seemed placed rather than scattered, the way the air grew cooler in subtle layers, and each detail added to the sense that this was not just open land, but a place shaped by presence, by memory, by something that had been here long before she understood how to see it. At one point they stopped, not all at once, not in a signal she could see, but in a shared pause that moved through them like a breath, and Eliza stopped with them, her gaze lifting toward the horizon where the light softened into gold. And for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, the silence stretching wide and deep across the land. The figure nearest to her lowered themselves to the ground, not in exhaustion, not in surrender, but in a way that felt deliberate, connected, and one by one the others followed, each movement unforced, natural, as if this moment had been part of the journey from the beginning. Eliza remained standing for a second longer, watching, feeling the space shift again, not pressing her, not demanding anything, just holding the possibility of her next step. Then she lowered herself as well, the ground firm beneath her, the air cooling as the sun dipped lower. And for the first time since she had climbed out of the well, she allowed herself to simply be still, not searching, not deciding, just present. The pendant in her pocket felt heavier now, not in weight, but in meaning, and she reached for it without thinking, holding it loosely in her hand as the light faded across the land. No one looked at her directly. No one waited for her to speak. And in that absence of expectation, she found something she had not known she was missing: the freedom to exist without explanation, without defense, without the need to prove anything to anyone. The sky deepened into color, the first hint of evening settling in, and as the light shifted, so did something inside her. Not a sudden change, not a revelation, but a quiet alignment, a sense that the distance between who she had been and who she was becoming was no longer something to measure. It was something to inhabit. Eliza Whitmore sat there among them, the land stretching wide in every direction, the past no longer behind her, but woven into the ground beneath her. And as the last of the daylight slipped toward the horizon, she understood without needing to say it that whatever came next would not be a return, it would be a continuation, a path that had already begun long before she knew to follow it. The night did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like a quiet decision being made without words, the last light of the sun stretching thin across the horizon before giving way to a deeper blue that wrapped itself around the land. And Eliza Whitmore remained seated among them, the ground firm beneath her, the air cooling in a way that carried both stillness and something unseen moving just beyond it. No fire was lit. No voices broke the silence. And yet the darkness did not feel empty. It felt held, as if the land itself knew exactly where each of them was and had no need to announce it. Eliza's hand rested loosely around the pendant, her fingers tracing its edges without looking, the patterns now familiar in a way she could not explain, not because she had learned them, but because something in her recognized them, the same way one recognizes a melody they have never been taught, but somehow already know. She lifted her gaze toward the sky, the first stars appearing one by one, not rushed, not crowded, just present. And for a moment she felt the distance between herself and everything she had known stretch wider than it ever had, not in loneliness, but in clarity. The figure beside her shifted slightly, drawing her attention not with sound, but with presence. And when Eliza turned her head, she saw the faint outline of a hand moving, slow and deliberate, tracing something into the dust between them. She leaned closer, her eyes adjusting to the low light, watching as the fingers moved across the ground, leaving behind simple lines that curved and met in ways she had seen before, not exactly the same, but carrying the same intention, the same quiet structure of meaning. Eliza did not speak, did not ask what it meant. She watched, her breath steady, her mind not racing to interpret, but allowing the shapes to exist as they were. And when the hand lifted away, leaving the pattern complete, something inside her shifted again, not sudden, not overwhelming, but precise, like a piece falling into place where it had always belonged. She lowered her own hand slowly, hesitating only for a moment before pressing her fingers into the dust beside the drawing, and without thinking, without planning, she began to move, tracing a line that mirrored part of what she had seen below, part of what she had felt in the metal beneath her fingertips, her movements careful but certain, as if guided by something deeper than memory. The person beside her did not interrupt, did not correct, only watched, their stillness unchanged. And when Eliza finished, lifting her hand back from the ground, the two patterns rested side by side, not identical, but connected, like two halves of a conversation spoken in different moments but understood as one. The wind passed lightly over the surface, soft enough not to erase what had been drawn, just enough to remind her that nothing here was fixed. Everything moved, everything shifted, and yet some things remained. Eliza sat back slightly, her gaze lingering on the shapes before letting them go, her eyes lifting once more toward the horizon where the last trace of light had disappeared, leaving only the vast stretch of night. Time passed without measure, minutes or hours. She could not tell, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she did not feel the need to track it, to hold on to it, to make sense of it. She simply let it move around her. At some point, the group shifted again, not all at once, but in that same quiet rhythm she had begun to recognize, some standing, others remaining seated, the space adjusting without disruption. And Eliza felt the change before she saw it, the subtle movement of energy that signaled something new without breaking what already existed. She rose slowly, not because she was told to, not because she felt expected to, but because it felt right, her body moving with a calm certainty that no longer questioned itself. The pendant in her hand caught a faint glimmer of starlight, the patterns reflecting just enough to be seen. And for a moment she held it up, not examining it, but acknowledging it, before letting it rest once more in her palm. The figure who had drawn beside her stepped forward, not away, not ahead, but slightly to the side, creating a space that extended beyond where they had been sitting, a path that did not lead sharply in any direction, but opened gently into the darkness. Eliza did not hesitate this time. She stepped forward into that space, her boots pressing softly into the ground, her posture steady, her gaze forward but not fixed, and as she moved, the others followed in their own rhythm, not surrounding her, not guiding her, simply moving alongside, their presence a constant that did not demand attention but offered it freely. The night deepened around them, the land stretching out in quiet layers, and Eliza Whitmore walked into it without looking back, not because she had nothing left behind, but because she understood now that what she carried did not need to be seen to remain. And as the stars settled fully into the sky above, the path beneath her feet became something more than distance. It became direction, something chosen, something lived, something that would not return her to who she had been, but would reveal, step by step, who she had always been becoming. The land felt different under Eliza Whitmore's feet as the night deepened, not because it had changed, but because she had, and the difference revealed itself in small ways, in how she noticed the rise and fall of the ground before stepping, in how the wind seemed to carry meaning rather than just movement, in how the silence between the figures around her no longer felt like absence, but like a language waiting to be understood. They walked for what could have been miles or minutes, time no longer holding the same shape it once had, and Eliza did not ask where they were going because she realized the question itself no longer mattered, not in the way it used to. The pendant in her hand warmed slightly as she moved, or perhaps it was her hand that had changed, her awareness sharpening to the point where even the smallest shift felt significant, and she found herself turning it slowly between her fingers, not searching for answers, but recognizing patterns that now felt closer than her own thoughts. Ahead, the land dipped gently, the darkness pooling in a shallow valley where the stars seemed to gather more densely above, and without any signal given, the group slowed. Their steps easing into stillness once again, Eliza followed, stopping at the edge of the dip, her gaze lifting instinctively to take in the space. And for a moment, she felt the same quiet pull she had felt at the well, not downward this time, but inward, as if something beneath the surface of this place was acknowledging her presence without needing to be seen. One of the figures moved forward into the center of the shallow valley, their silhouettes steady against the dim light, and lowered themselves to the ground with the same deliberate grace she had seen before, hands resting lightly on the earth as if greeting it rather than using it for support. The others remained where they were, forming a wide, open circle that did not close in but held space. And Eliza felt it, that subtle shift again, the sense that something was about to be shared, not through words, but through presence. She stepped forward, not fully into the center, but close enough to feel the change in the air, cooler here, quieter, as if the land itself had drawn a breath and was holding it. The figure at the center began to move their hands slowly across the ground, tracing lines that caught faint starlight, patterns forming and dissolving as the dust shifted under their touch. And Eliza watched, her focus steady, her mind not reaching ahead, but staying with each movement as it happened. She noticed how the lines curved differently than before, broader, more open, less contained. And something inside her responded to that, a recognition that did not come from thought, but from alignment. When the drawing was complete, the figure lifted their hands and remained still, and for a long moment nothing happened. No one spoke, no one moved, the silence stretching out until it felt like part of the pattern itself. Then, without prompting, Eliza stepped forward the final distance into the center, her boots pressing softly into the marked ground, her eyes lowering to the lines before her, and she felt it again, stronger now, that quiet sense of knowing, not what the pattern meant, but what it asked of her. She crouched slowly, her movements mirroring the calm she felt, and placed her hand lightly on the earth, not over the lines, but beside them, her fingers spreading slightly as if listening through touch. The pendant slipped from her grip and rested against her palm, its surface meeting the ground at the edge of the pattern. And in that simple contact something shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a connection being completed rather than created. Eliza did not react outwardly, did not pull back or look around. She remained still, her breath even, her awareness focused inward and outward at the same time. And in that stillness, she understood something her father had never written, something he had only left space for her to discover. This was not about choosing between two worlds. It was about standing in both without losing either. She lifted her hand slowly, the pendant rising with it, and the lines in the dust remained unchanged. Yet the space felt different, fuller, as if something unseen had settled into place. Eliza stood again, her posture steady, her gaze lifting to meet the figure before her. And for the first time since she had stepped into this new path, she allowed a small shift in her expression, not a smile, not a statement, but a quiet acceptance of what had already begun. The figure inclined their head once more, and this time Eliza mirrored it without hesitation. The movement natural, unforced, and around them the others began to shift, the circle loosening, the formation opening, as if the moment had reached its natural end without needing to be declared. The night remained deep and quiet, the stars steady above, and Eliza Whitmore stepped back from the center, not retreating, but carrying what had just passed within her, something that could not be seen from the outside, but would shape every step she took from this point forward. And as the group began to move again, the path ahead no longer felt unknown. It felt like something she had been walking toward long before she ever knew to look for it. The movement resumed without announcement, as if the land itself had decided the moment had passed and the next had already begun, and Eliza Whitmore stepped forward with them, not following anymore, not being led, but moving as part of something that no longer needed direction to hold together. The valley behind them faded into shadow, the patterns in the dust left undisturbed, not erased, not preserved, simply allowed to exist where they were, and Eliza did not look back because she understood now that what mattered did not remain in places, it moved with those who carried it. The ground began to rise gradually, the slope gentle but steady, and as they climbed, the air shifted again, thinning slightly, carrying a coolness that settled deeper into her lungs. And with it came a clarity she had not known she was missing, a sense that each breath reached further than before. The figures around her moved in the same quiet rhythm, their presence unchanged, and yet something in the way they held themselves felt lighter, not less grounded, but more open, as if a boundary had been crossed not just by her, but by all of them together. Eliza's hand rested at her side now, the pendant no longer held tightly, its weight familiar enough that she did not need to check its presence. And as she walked, she became aware of something else, a faint sound carried on the wind, distant but distinct, not a voice, not a call, but something shaped, something that repeated in a pattern, just beyond clear hearing. She slowed slightly, her head turning just enough to listen, and the figure nearest to her noticed, not by looking directly, but by adjusting their pace to match hers, allowing the moment without interrupting it. The sound came again, softer this time, like breath moving across something hollow, and Eliza felt it resonate somewhere deep inside her, not in her ears, but in the same place that had responded to the patterns in the dust, the same place that had recognized the markings in the metal before her mind could name them. She did not speak, did not ask what it was, because she understood that whatever she was hearing was not meant to be explained, it was meant to be felt, to be allowed. The path leveled out as they reached the crest of the rise, and beyond it the land opened wide, the horizon stretching farther than she had seen from her ranch, the darkness softer here, less confined, the sky broader, filled with more stars than she remembered ever noticing before. They stopped again, not in a circle this time, not in formation, but in a loose gathering that allowed each of them space, and Eliza stood among them, her gaze moving slowly across the expanse, taking in the subtle shapes of distant hills, the faint glimmer of something reflecting starlight far off, something that might have been water or stone or something else entirely. The sound returned, clearer now, still distant but unmistakable, a low, steady rhythm that rose and fell like breath, and Eliza felt her body respond to it without instruction, her stance shifting slightly, her weight settling more firmly into the ground, as if aligning with something she could not see. One of the figures moved ahead a few steps, then paused, turning just enough to allow the others to see, and Eliza followed with her eyes, noticing how the space ahead seemed to deepen, not physically, but in presence, as if the land itself held something more concentrated there. She took a step forward, then another, drawn not by curiosity, but by recognition, and as she moved closer, the sound grew stronger, still soft, still distant, but now undeniably part of the space around her. The ground beneath her feet felt different again, firmer, more compact, and when she looked down, she saw faint impressions in the soil, not random, not scattered, but repeating, a pattern of steps that had crossed this place many times before, worn into the earth by presence rather than force. Eliza paused at the edge of that space, her breath steady, her gaze lifting slowly to meet what lay ahead, and for a moment the world seemed to hold itself still, the wind quiet, the stars steady, the figures around her unmoving. She did not step forward immediately, not because she hesitated, but because she understood that this moment was not about movement. It was about awareness, about seeing clearly what she had only begun to feel. The pendant shifted slightly against her side, catching a faint glimmer of light, and without thinking she reached for it, her fingers closing around its familiar shape, grounding her in the present even as everything around her seemed to stretch beyond it. Eliza Whitmore stood there at the edge of something she could not yet name, the sound rising and falling like a quiet pulse beneath the surface of the night, and she knew, without needing to be told, that whatever waited ahead was not separate from what she had already become. It was the next step in a path that had never truly been hidden, only waiting for her to see it. She took a breath, slow and deep, and stepped forward. Eliza Whitmore stepped into the space as if crossing a line no one else could see, and the moment her boot pressed into that patterned ground, the low rhythm she had been hearing settled into something clearer, not louder, but closer, like it had always been there waiting for her to recognize it. The air felt denser here, not heavy, but full, as if every breath carried something more than just night and wind, and she slowed without deciding to, her body adjusting to the shift the way it had. Beneath the earth, the way it had beside the well, each step deliberate, grounded, certain. The figures behind her did not follow immediately. They remained where they were, holding the edge of the space, not as a barrier, but as a boundary that belonged to her alone now. And Eliza felt that separation without turning back, felt the quiet weight of being the only one moving forward. The ground beneath her boots held the faint impressions she had seen before, but here they were deeper, more defined. The repeated passage of many steps pressed into the soil over time, not worn down by force, but shaped by presence, by intention, and she placed her feet within those impressions without thinking, aligning herself with something that had come before her. The rhythm in the air shifted again, rising slightly, then settling, and Eliza felt it move through her chest, not as sound, but as something that resonated, something that matched the steady beat of her own breath. And for a moment the distance between her body and the space around her seemed to dissolve, not disappearing, but becoming less defined. She moved further in, the center of the space revealing itself not as a structure or a place marked by objects, but by absence. A clearing where the ground lay undisturbed except for the faint patterns that curved and crossed in ways that echoed what she had seen drawn in the dust before. And she stopped there, not because she reached an end, but because she understood this was where she was meant to stand. The night pressed close, not in darkness, but in presence, the stars above steady and clear, the horizon wide and quiet, and Eliza let her shoulders settle, her arms resting naturally at her sides, her breathing slowing until it matched the rhythm that moved through the air. She did not look for instruction, did not wait for a sign, because there was none, only the stillness that held her in place. The pendant in her hand grew warmer, or perhaps her awareness of it deepened, and without thinking she lifted it slightly, holding it in front of her, not high, not for display, just enough to feel its presence between her and the space she stood in. The patterns etched into its surface caught the faint light of the stars, reflecting in small, shifting lines that seemed to move even. When her hand was still, and Eliza focused on that movement, not with her eyes alone, but with that same quiet sense that had guided her since she stepped into the well, she lowered herself slowly, her knees meeting the ground with a softness that did not disturb the patterns beneath her, and placed the pendant gently on the earth in front of her, not pressing it down, not setting it apart, simply letting it rest where it touched. The rhythm in the air deepened, not in volume, but in presence, and Eliza felt it settle into her, not overwhelming, not demanding, just aligning, like two separate things finding the same pace without needing to adjust. Her hands rested lightly on her thighs, her posture steady, her gaze soft but focused, and for a long moment nothing changed, nothing moved, the world holding itself in that quiet balance. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the air shifted again, not outwardly, but within her, something loosening, something opening, not in a way that could be seen, but in a way that could be felt, and Eliza understood without words that this was not something being given to her. It was something she was allowing. The boundary she had felt before, between what she knew and what she did not, between the life she had lived and the one unfolding now, began to thin, not breaking, not disappearing, but becoming something she could move through rather than stand against. She did not close her eyes, did not retreat inward. She remained exactly where she was, present in the space, aware of the ground beneath her, the air around her, the rhythm moving through it all. And in that awareness, she felt something settle, something that had been uncertain finding its place without needing to be named. The figures at the edge remained still, their presence unchanged, not watching in expectation, not measuring her, simply holding the space as it was, allowing the moment to belong entirely to her. Eliza Whitmore remained there, kneeling in the center of that quiet clearing, the pendant resting against the earth, the night stretching wide above her. And she understood then, not as a thought, but as a certainty, that she had not been brought here to be changed into something new. She had been brought here to recognize what had always been part of her, something that did not need to be earned or proven, only accepted. The rhythm softened, not fading, but settling, becoming part of the silence rather than standing apart from it. And Eliza reached forward slowly, her hand hovering for a brief second before closing gently around the pendant once more. Lifting it from the ground with the same care she had placed it there, she rose without hurry. her movements steady, her posture unchanged yet entirely different. And as she turned back toward the edge where the others waited, the space behind her did not feel empty. It felt complete, as if nothing more needed to happen there. She stepped forward, leaving the center without hesitation, and as she crossed that unseen boundary once more, the distance between her and the others dissolved, not because she returned to them, but because she no longer stood apart from what they represented. Eliza Whitmore did not look back at the place she had just left, because she understood now that it was not a place she needed to return to. It was something she carried with her, something that would shape every step she took from this point forward, not through force, not through memory, but through the quiet certainty of knowing exactly who she was becoming. When Eliza Whitmore stepped back among them, nothing was said, nothing was signaled, and yet everything had already been understood, the kind of understanding that does not arrive with words but settles quietly into the spaces between them. And as she took her place within their presence once more, she felt no separation, no distance left to measure, only a steady alignment that carried through her posture, her breath, the way her eyes met the horizon without searching for something beyond it. The night remained deep and wide, the stars unmoving in their quiet watch, and the figures around her shifted subtly, not gathering, not dispersing, but adjusting as if the moment itself had turned, like a page in a story that did not need to be read aloud to be known. Eliza did not ask what came next, because the question no longer held weight, and as they began to move again, she moved with them, her steps no longer guided by uncertainty or even curiosity, but by something steadier, something that felt like recognition rather than discovery. The land unfolded beneath them in long, quiet stretches, the rise and fall of the terrain no longer unfamiliar, each contour feeling less like something to cross and more like something she already understood without needing to think about it. The pendant rested against her side, its presence constant, not drawing attention, but grounding her in a way that no longer required focus. And as she walked, she noticed how her awareness extended beyond herself, how the rhythm of the group, the movement of the wind, the subtle shifts in the air all seemed connected, not separate pieces but part of a larger pattern she was beginning to feel rather than see. At some point, the horizon ahead began to change, the darkness thinning just enough to reveal the faintest hint of early light, not yet dawn, but the promise of it, and Eliza slowed slightly, her gaze lifting toward that edge where night and day began to meet. The figures around her did the same, not stopping, not breaking their movement, but acknowledging the shift with a quiet awareness that passed through them like a shared breath. The air cooled further, carrying a clarity that sharpened every detail, and Eliza felt it settle into her, the same way the silence had, the same way the patterns in the dust had, becoming part of her without effort. They came to a gentle rise, not steep, not imposing, just enough to lift them above the surrounding land. And as they reached the top, the view opened wide, the faint light spreading slowly across the horizon, revealing the vast stretch of the world beyond in soft, gradual layers. Eliza stopped there, not because she needed to, but because something in the moment called for stillness, and the others stopped with her, not in formation, not in structure, just present, each one grounded in their own space while sharing the same view. The first line of light broke across the land, subtle at first, then stronger, casting long, quiet shadows that stretched behind them, and Eliza felt it then. The transition not just in the sky, but within herself, the shift from what had been hidden to what could now be seen, not as a revelation, but as a continuation. She glanced once, just once, back in the direction they had come from, not searching for the well, not measuring the distance, but acknowledging the path that had brought her here, and for a moment the memory of that circle of stone, that rope, that descent into darkness felt distant, not because it had faded, but because it had completed its purpose. When she turned forward again, her gaze did not wander, it settled, steady and calm, taking in the land before her without needing to question it, and in that stillness she understood something that had been forming since the moment she read her father's words, that the life she had known had not been taken from her. It had simply been a beginning she had now grown beyond. The figures around her did not look to her for direction, did not wait for her to speak or move. And yet there was a quiet shift in the way they held themselves, a subtle recognition that did not place her above or apart, but among them in a way that carried weight. Eliza Whitmore stood there at the edge of morning, the first light touching her face, her posture steady, her presence grounded, and without needing to announce it, without needing to prove it, she had become something the world she left behind would not fully understand, not because it was hidden, but because it required more than sight to recognize. The wind moved across the rise, carrying the scent of the land, and she let it pass through her without resistance, without thought, simply allowing it to be part of the moment. No one spoke, no one needed to. And as the light grew stronger, revealing more of the world with each passing second, Eliza felt no urgency to move forward or to return, only the quiet certainty that wherever she stepped next, it would not be as the person who had once stood beside that well. It would be as someone who carried both the depth of what she had discovered and the strength to live within it without dividing herself. And in that quiet, as the day began to rise fully into view, Eliza Whitmore did not claim what she had become. She simply stood in it, steady, silent, and unmistakably changed. The light continued to rise, slow and certain, stretching across the land in a way that revealed everything without forcing it. And Eliza Whitmore stood at that edge of morning without moving, not because she was unsure, but because there was nothing left to rush toward, nothing left to escape from. Only the quiet weight of what she now carried settling fully into place. The figures around her did not shift when the sun touched them, did not react to the change in the sky, and that steadiness told her something more than words ever could, that this moment, like the ones before it, did not belong to time alone. It belonged to something deeper, something that did not end when the light came. Eliza's gaze moved once more across the land, but this time it did not search. It did not measure distance or mark boundaries. It simply saw the hills, the long stretch of earth, the faint line where her ranch would be somewhere beyond sight, all of it part of the same ground, no longer divided into what was hers and what was not. Her hand rested briefly over the pendant, not gripping it, not checking it, just acknowledging its presence. And for the first time, she did not think of it as something given to her. She understood it as something that had always belonged where it now rested. The wind moved across the rise again, softer in the daylight, carrying the scent of dust and something else beneath it, something living, something growing, and Eliza breathed it in without hesitation, without separating it from herself. One of the figures beside her took a step forward, not toward a destination, but into the day itself, and the others followed in that same unspoken rhythm, not forming lines, not creating structure, simply moving as they always had, steady, grounded, present. Eliza did not wait this time. She stepped forward with them, not after, not behind, but among them, her pace neither leading nor following, just aligned. The ground beneath her felt the same as it had before, and yet it did not, each step carrying a quiet awareness that had not been there when she had walked this land as something separate from it. As they moved, the light grew stronger, revealing more detail in the world around them. The subtle shifts in color across the soil, the texture of the grass, the distant outline of ridges she had never noticed before, and Eliza took it in without naming it, without needing to understand it beyond what it was. Time moved forward, but it no longer pressed against her. It moved with her, and that difference settled into her like something she had been missing without knowing it. After a while, the group slowed again, not stopping fully, but easing into a pace that allowed space between each step, and Eliza felt it, that same quiet signal. That something was shifting once more, not dramatically, not with force, but in the same way the night had given way to morning, naturally, inevitably. The figure who had first stepped toward her at the edge of her land turned slightly, not to face her directly, but enough that their presence met hers again, and for a moment they stood in that shared awareness, the distance between them no longer measured in feet, but in something much smaller, something that no longer needed to be crossed. Eliza held that moment without reaching for it, without trying to define it, and in that stillness she understood what her father had never written in his letter, what he had only left for her to find. That truth was not something passed down fully formed. It was something lived into, step by step, choice by choice. until it became part of you without needing to be explained. The figure inclined their head once more, the same quiet gesture she had come to recognize, and this time Eliza did not pause. She returned it immediately, not as a learned action, but as something that now belonged to her. The others continued moving, the land opening before them, the day settling fully into place, and Eliza turned with them, her steps steady, her posture unchanged yet entirely new. Somewhere far behind her, beyond the reach of sight, the well remained as it always had, a circle of stone marking a place that few would ever understand. But Eliza did not need to return to it, did not need to guard it, because she understood now that what it held was no longer hidden from her. It was carried within her, quiet and unshakable. The ranch, the town, the life she had known would continue as they always had, shaped by the same beliefs, the same limits. But she no longer stood within those boundaries in the same way. She stood beyond them without rejecting them, part of both without being confined to either. The sun rose higher, the shadows shortening, the land fully revealed in the clarity of day, and Eliza Whitmore walked forward without hesitation, not towards something new, but into something that had been waiting for her all along. She did not speak, did not look back, did not mark the moment in any outward way, and yet everything had already been marked, not in the ground, not in the sky, but in the quiet certainty of who she had become. Out here, there was no need for words to declare change, no need for witnesses to confirm it, because the land itself carried the truth, and Eliza Whitmore now walked it as someone who no longer needed to choose between where she came from and where she was going. She simply moved forward, steady, silent, and fully her own.